Welcome everyone. We've got a doozy of a chess game here. This one is mostly opening theory, and so we'll kind of breeze through that first part there, but then it's really nice instructional chess from there. And so let's just get right into this amazing game. So I started with d4, they play knight f6. Again, I said most of this will be opening theory. We're playing some regular moves here. This c5 is kind of the old Benoni type approach. So we're in the main line of the Benoni defense here. e6 of course helped their bishop get developed. Continuing to develop pieces on my part as well. We have a trade in the center. Now grabbing more central space. And now as thematic in many of these lines, black will intend to fianchetto their bishop, playing g6, then bishop g7. It is worth noting that sometimes black will play a move like knight b to d7, possibly bringing this knight to e5. White will usually just play bishop d3, secure their center, and white has a slight advantage. So we have g6 here. Knight f3, fianchettoing, and now pawn to h3. And so we're in the classical line of the Benoni here, and then h3 is this New York variation, with the purpose of stopping mostly the bishop from going to g4 and pinning this knight. If it wasn't for that pin, then bishop to d3 would be our move, but if there is a bishop on g4, then bishop to e2 is probably better. And because we don't want to be passive with bishop e2, that's why h3 to try and get bishop d3. But now here's where things start getting a little bit more instructional, because you might ask yourself, why not bishop g2 earlier? If I go back a move, we'll see that knight f3 was played. Bishop g4 is an immediate option. But in that line, we actually have queen check, and now the bishop is probably going to have to come back and actually has wasted a tempo. If instead they try and block something like, say, the knight, then there's many good moves, but the surprising one is actually knight back to g1. And this bishop is getting very close to getting trapped. It can't retreat to any of these squares, and if it retreats back to h5, then pawn h3 is threatening g4. But okay, that's an interesting sideline. Going back to our position, black will choose to castle. Bishop d3 as prepared. And now simply trying to put more pressure in the center. Rook to e8. White wants to get their king out of the center pin, so they will castle. And now we see pawn to a6, which is attempting the Spanish Benoni formation, where black will play this pawn to b5 and get this type of setup here. If you study the Benoni defense, you'll know that this setup with black's pawns on the squares I highlighted in red is usually an advantage for black. And so of course as white, I really want to avoid this. The main threat is them playing pawn b5, and we avoid this by playing pawn to a4 ourselves, gaining space and stopping the pawn from going to b5. And now what I expected was knight b to d7, and in that case I can probably play the bishop to f4, and this is still opening theory where now I'm adding pressure to this backwards pawn. But instead of knight b to d7, the game went a little bit differently, with queen to c7. As I wasn't really sure where to put my bishop in this case, in the game I ended up choosing f4. But what's kind of interesting is the engine is actually recommending this bishop to e3, and choosing not to go after this pawn in this line. But as I played it, we're still doing okay. Pawn advancing, and now bishop back. And so very similar to what we looked at earlier, now we have knight b to d7. And my response was logical, but objectively not best. My idea was simply rook to e1, try and add more support to my center pawn. But even better than this was instead queen e2, with the idea that I'm now adding pressure to this pawn as well. And keep in mind, b5 is more difficult to play themselves. I didn't really like this in the game, although it was a candidate move of mine. It was a little unnatural for me to put the queen and rook on the same file, especially with a lot of pressure on this e4 pawn. But this is the engine's recommendation. The game continued with knight to c5. If instead of that, the knight going to e5, then white can trade knights, and then simply move the bishop. And you'll notice that now white actually has a pass pawn here on d5, which might long term end up going to d6, and black has to be very, very careful this pawn doesn't start advancing dangerously into black's territory. But as such, with knight c5, this was kind of the first decent think of the game that I really had. Mainly what I was looking at was, can I push pawn to e5? My conclusion was that yes, I actually can. In this case, they chose to trade. And now I debated on whether I should first throw in this in-between move of pawn d6. Very similar to what we mentioned, this is a really good pass pawn. Or should I instead go the safer route and just simply recapture with the knight on e5? Now in the real game I captured with the knight, because I thought that after pawn d6 that might be a mistake, because now they can simply move their queen away. Knight captures e5, bishop b6 holding this pawn, and I feel like white has given up a good part of their advantage as this pawn is actually a little bit difficult to defend. Notice that these squares that my knight would go to here, both here and here to defend the pawn on d6, are heavily defended by black. So back in this position instead, knight captures e5, and here's where things get a little bit tricky. They play knight to h5, which is an interesting idea because now they have an extra attacker attacking this knight. I can throw in the in-between move d6, but after some thinking, even stronger than this was simply knight captures g6. Very surprising looking move, but the main principle behind it is we have this rook that is hanging with check on e8. So they probably want to trade rooks first. But now black is faced with this dilemma. How do you deal with this check on the back rank? If you go somewhere like queen d8, then there's actually bishop c7 trying to decoy the queen. If instead you go to a light square where the bishop cannot chase it, then you bring in the other bishop and you try and chase the queen with the same thing, luring it away from e8 and this strong check. And there isn't really a good defense here. So instead black captures on f4, thinking that knight is going to recapture here and keep black up material. But the reason that I chose to move the knight to g6 is because I wanted really strong control on this square. For the reason very clear after this move. They only have one legal move to block, and then this was a very surprising checkmate. Now all that happened very quickly, but where exactly did black go wrong? Well, back here, the very first inaccuracy of the game was queen to c7, and although it wasn't really a big deal in this move by itself, bishop f4 is a really good developing move. Now we did mention why, because we're attacking this pawn, adding more pressure to the center, but notice that white is just continuing to develop pieces. And I know a lot of beginners and intermediates sometimes kind of shrug this off. I myself have done this far too often and been guilty of thinking I should play more advanced ideas than just developing. But piece development is really important. But it's not simply just get your pieces off the back rank. You have to consider where are your pieces best located. And as of now, my most popular chess video, this one here on that very topic, where I get a little bit more in depth into where the best square for a piece is actually, and not just simply developing for the sake of developing. Now black's move wasn't bad by any means. They played pawn to c4, attacking my bishop, which is a strong threat and I had to react to it. But this is only the second best move by the engine, and already black was a little bit walking a tightrope here. The very best move, not surprisingly, is the developing move, knight b to d7. And then probably try and get the knight to e5, get the c8 bishop into the game, and play continues. Now, although I didn't play perfectly, notice how much emphasis is really on piece development here. After c4, of course I have to move my bishop. They choose to develop, and then I choose to develop. They spend another move moving their knight. But now that gives me the chance to strike in the center with pawn to e5. And really it was downhill from here, but one thing really just led to the next. All because I continuously kept developing pieces. And so this real simple approach of developing is actually very important, and will be a very common theme in many miniatures such as this game. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.